Halfway through his story, Michael's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The Ed Sullivan Theater went silent, and a 10-year-old boy looked back at his brothers with eyes that said, "Help." 20 million people were watching. The cameras kept rolling, and for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Nobody knew what would happen next. December 14th, 1969. The biggest night of Michael Jackson's life was about to become every performer's worst nightmare. The Ed Sullivan Theater hummed with energy that Sunday night. 461 seats, every one filled. Backstage, 10-year-old Michael Jackson stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his purple hat for the 5th time in 2 minutes. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. "You okay?" Jermaine asked, leaning against the dressing room door frame. "Yeah," Michael said quickly. Too quickly. He wasn't okay. He was terrified in a way he'd never been before. This wasn't a club in Gary. This wasn't even the Apollo Theater, where at least the crowd gave you a chance. This was Ed Sullivan. The show that made the Beatles. The show that made Elvis. The show that could make or break you in 3 minutes of live television. And Michael had to do something he'd never done on TV before. Tell a story. A cute childhood memory about playing in a sandbox. Just him. Just words. No music to hide behind. "Michael, 5 minutes," a production assistant called through the door. Katherine Jackson appeared beside her son, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Baby, you don't have to do the sandbox story if you don't want to." "I want to," Michael said, but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Joe Jackson stood near the doorway, arms crossed. "You'll be fine. Just remember what we practiced." But Michael barely heard him. His mind was racing through the lines he was supposed to say, the story about playing in a sandbox, the cute setup before "Who's Loving You?" Simple. Easy, except right now, standing under the fluorescent lights of the dressing room, the words felt slippery in his mind. What if I forget? The thought arrived like cold water. What if he got out there under the lights in front of 20 million people and the words just disappeared? Places, everyone. Jackson 5, you're on in 2. The stage was bigger than Michael remembered from rehearsal. The lights were brighter, hotter. The audience was a wall of shadowy faces beyond the glare, invisible but present, like a held breath waiting to be released. Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, and Marlon took their positions. Michael walked to the front, the purple hat sitting just right, his vest buttoned, his smile in place, professional, prepared. But inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The applause swelled as Ed Sullivan's voice boomed across the theater. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Jackson 5. The lights hit, the cameras locked on, and Michael stepped up to the microphone. This was it, the sandbox story. Just a few cute lines, then straight into the song. Easy. Michael opened his mouth. "When I was playing in a sandbox." Good. The first line came out clean, his voice steady. The audience leaned in. "There was this little girl." Wait, what was the next line? Michael's mind went blank. Completely, utterly blank. The words he'd rehearsed 20 times that afternoon, the story he'd told in the dressing room, the lines Joe had drilled into him. Gone. Vanished. As if they'd never existed. His mouth opened again. Nothing came out. The Ed Sullivan Theater went silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, the terrible silence of something going wrong. Michael's eyes went wide. His hands, hanging at his sides, started to tremble. He could feel the heat of the lights on his face, the weight of 20 million people watching through their television screens, the camera zooming in to catch every flicker of panic crossing his features. And then Michael did the only thing he could think of. He looked back. Jermaine stood 3 feet behind him, frozen mid-smile. Their eyes met, and in that single glance Michael's expression said everything. Help. I forgot. What do I do? Backstage in the wings where the Jackson family waited, Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. Joe's jaw tightened. A stage manager signaled to the control room. We have a problem. The seconds stretched. 1, 2, 3. In the control room, the director's finger hovered over a button. Do we cut to commercial? Not yet, the producer murmured, eyes locked on the monitor showing a 10-year-old boy standing alone under a spotlight, looking lost. But here's the part you can't miss. Because what happened next wasn't something anyone taught Michael Jackson. It wasn't in the rehearsal notes. It wasn't part of the plan. Jermaine, still holding his brother's gaze, gave the smallest nod. Not a nod that said, I'll save you. A nod that said, you got this. And somehow, impossibly, that tiny gesture unlocked something in Michael's mind. The words came back. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. Michael turned back to the microphone, took a breath that the front row audience could see, and smiled. Not the rehearsed performer's smile, a real smile. The smile of a kid who just remembered he wasn't alone up here. And we became friends, Michael continued, his voice a little softer now, a little more human. The story picked up where it had fractured. The audience, who'd been holding their breath, exhaled. He finished the sandbox story, not exactly as rehearsed. He skipped a line, reordered another. But he finished it. And then, without missing a beat, the opening notes of Who's Loving You filled the theater. What nobody in that audience knew, what even Michael didn't fully understand in that moment, was that the freeze had changed everything. Because when Michael opened his mouth to sing Who's Loving You, something was different. The fear that had gripped him 30 seconds ago, the panic that had blanked his mind, it didn't disappear. It transformed. He sang with a rawness that hadn't been there in rehearsal, with a vulnerability that couldn't be taught. The lyrics about loss, about heartbreak, about longing, they didn't sound like a 10-year-old boy performing a song anymore. They sounded real. In the wings, Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. On stage, Jermaine and Jackie exchanged a glance that said, "Did you hear that?" In the audience, people leaned forward in their seats, captivated. And in the back of the theater, Ed Sullivan, who'd seen every act in the world, who'd introduced legends, who rarely showed emotion, whispered to his assistant, "That little fella is something else." The song built. Michael's voice climbed. He hit notes that seemed impossible for someone his age, not because of technique but because of the emotion behind them. When he finished, the final note hanging in the air like a question, the theater erupted. Not polite applause, not the measured clapping of a TV audience told when to react. Real applause, the kind that says you just witnessed something you won't forget. Backstage, the moment Michael stepped off stage, his brothers surrounded him. "Man, what happened out there?" Marlon asked, his eyes wide. "I forgot," Michael admitted, his voice small. "I completely forgot the words." "We know," Jermaine said, "but you didn't let it stop you." Joe Jackson approached, and Michael braced himself for anger. Instead, his father placed a hand on his shoulder. "You recovered. That's what matters. Most performers freeze and stay frozen. You found your way back." Catherine pulled Michael into a hug. "I'm proud of you, baby. Not because you were perfect, because you were brave." A production assistant appeared. Mr. Sullivan would like to see the family. The walk to Ed Sullivan's office felt longer than the performance. Michael's heart, which had finally started to slow down, picked up again. Was this where they got told they'd never be invited back? That the mistake was too big? Ed Sullivan sat behind his desk, still in his suit, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," he said. The Jackson family sat. Ed looked directly at Michael. "Son, do you know what I saw out there tonight?" Michael shook his head, afraid to speak. "A performer." Ed leaned forward. "Someone who thinks on their feet when things go wrong. Your son froze in front of 20 million people, looked at his brothers and kept going, then sang with more honesty than most adults I've seen on this stage." Ed stood, extending his hand to Michael. "You'll be back on this show. Count on it." The phone at 2300 Jackson Street didn't stop ringing the next day. Friends, neighbors, music industry people. But the calls that mattered most came from parents whose kids had been scared to perform, and seeing Michael recover gave them courage. Barry Gordy, head of Motown Records, called Joe personally. That moment when Michael forgot his lines could have been a disaster. Instead, it became the most human moment of the night. How does a 10-year-old do that? "I don't know," Joe admitted, but he did. Years later, in an '83 interview, Michael was asked about that night. "The Ed Sullivan Show. You froze during the sandbox story. Do you remember?" Michael nodded slowly. "I remember every second. My mind just went blank." "What made you keep going?" "Jermaine." I looked back at him and he just nodded. Like he was saying, "I'm here. I remembered I wasn't doing this alone. If I fell, they'd catch me." Michael thought for a moment. "That night taught me that mistakes don't end you. What matters is whether you let the fear freeze you permanently or whether you find a way to move through it." December 14th, 1969, lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds on screen. But for 10-year-old Michael Jackson, it was the moment he learned the difference between performing perfectly and performing truthfully. That night, 20 million people watched a child forget his lines, panic, look to his brothers for help, and then do something no rehearsal could teach. Keep going. The sandbox story wasn't perfect, but Who's Loving You that followed, sung by a boy who'd just experienced real fear and real support, carried a weight perfection never could have achieved. That night, in front of 20 million people, a 10-year-old boy in a purple hat froze on the biggest stage in America, and what he did next became the moment everyone remembered. Not the freeze, the recovery, not the fear, the faith that he wasn't alone, not the mistake, the truth that followed.